Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to start a little early. My name is Ken Kirk. I'm the Executive Director of the National Association of Clean Water Agencies, and I want to thank you all for joining us today to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Clean Water Act, along with representatives of our other organizations representing the municipal community and WEF and the state community and a number of utilities from the metropolitan area. Clean Water Act is very personal to me. This time, 40 years ago, in September, I started a master's program in environmental law at the George Washington University under Arnold Wrightsey. And in October, a few days after October 18th, there was nothing in his book about clean water except maybe the 1898 Bridges and Harbors Act, and maybe a little bit more than that. But a few days after October 18th, we had 500 pages of Xerox information on the Clean Water Act, which we were expected to review and analyze and memorize between that time and the end of the year. And then in the summer of 1973, I went to the Environmental Protection Agency. It was my first job out of real law school, and worked for Administrator Train and in the Office of Legislation, which was in the administrator's office. And my first assignment was to oversee the implementation of the Clean Water Act by the administration. And looking back, I think they said, well, that's a new act, we'll give it to the rookie. And it was extremely complex and extremely interesting, and I learned a lot. And I worked with a lot of people outside of EPA and also inside of EPA. But the people that I remembered best, were outside of EPA. And these were folks who came in from time to time representing this newly formed organization called the Association of Metropolitan Sewerage Agencies. And they were from major urban areas around the country. I was from New York City. And I met with them, and I decided at that time that these were the people, and their agencies were the agencies that were going to make the difference in terms of whether this law was implemented or not. Of course, they were coming in to ask for money and make sure the money was there, but regardless, they represented the major urban areas in the country, and I knew at that time that I wanted to work for them. So it's only fitting that essentially I have spent my entire career working with or for them. And I think it was a great choice because they did deliver. They delivered on behalf of the American people. They delivered on behalf of their communities and their ratepayers. I remember the struggles they had implementing the secondary treatment requirements, and many had to go beyond that. I remembered all the work we did to implement the National Pretreatment Program, and also biosolids, or at the time sludge, management. And then we got into toxics, and then we got into wet weather issues, and the challenges kept on coming, and the requirements kept on coming, and they kept on delivering. True environmentalists in every word, working 24/7, 365 days a year, getting the job done. Not to say that enforcement didn't play a role in this, because at times our members didn't have the money, or maybe didn't have the initiative. But it all worked out, and we made tremendous progress. So I think one of the things that the Clean Water Act gave us was this path forward to deal with the very, very big issues in terms of water pollution that were evident in the early 1970s, and allowed us to make all this progress over 40 years. I think second, and perhaps more importantly, the Act helped us appreciate the value of water that much more. I mean, obviously everybody recalls the outrage, public outrage and demand for action by the Congress back in the early 70s that culminated in passage of the act over a presidential veto in 1972. And I think that commitment is with us still today. And if you just think about the organizations that are going to be speaking with us here this afternoon, practically every single one of them at one point or another had either pollution control or sewerage in their names. My organization was the Association of Metropolitan Sewerage Agencies. Alex's organization, the Association of Clean Water Administrators, was the Association of State and Interstate Pollution Control Administrators. WEF was the Water Pollution Control Federation. Alexandria was the Alexandria Sanitation Authority. DC Water was the DC Water and Wastewater or Water and Sewerage Authority. Even EPA, before there was an EPA, was the Federal Water Pollution Control Administration. And even the Act, when it was passed, wasn't the Clean Water Act. It was the Federal Water Pollution Control Act. So I think that tells us a lot, because that doesn't happen by itself. It happens with a lot of public support and understanding about the value of water. So these types of initiatives and actions, give me a lot of hope, for the future. Now, obviously, we are facing a situation where a certain percentage of our waters around the country are still impaired. We are facing an infrastructure gap that continues to widen. We are facing emerging regulatory challenges and population impacts. And we're facing a situation where there's less money to help us accomplish these things. In the final analysis, however, I think we need to look forward and not back. And I'll tell you where we're going from here in a second. We need smarter investment to advance clean water goals. We need a 2020 vision for clean water that acknowledges the need to adapt the Clean Water Act to the 21st century world. We need an act that can not only coexist, but can incentivize entities to adjust to an energy-constrained world, a water-constrained world, a funding-constrained world, a climate-driven world, and a world where non-regulated entities are now the predominant polluters of our nation's waters. So let's applaud the Clean Water Act for 4 decades of achievement and commit to taking the steps we need to ensure continued water quality gains in the future. Thank you, and with that, I'm going to introduce Ellen Galinsky, Senior Policy Advisor with EPA. The other individuals who are going to come up after Ellen will introduce themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken, and thanks, everyone. I'm delighted to be here today with all of you to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. And looking around the room, I see at least a few faces who were there at the first birthday, along with me, albeit in college, but undergrad, not master's. But we're all here for a simple reason. We recognize that clean water is vital to our health, our environment, and our economy. A generation ago, the American people faced health and environmental issues and threats in their waters that are almost unimaginable to us today, standing here today. In the 40 years since its passage, the Clean Water Act has kept tens of billions of pounds of sewage, chemicals, and trash out of our waterways. Urban waterways have gone from wastelands to centers of redevelopment and vitality. We have doubled the number of American waters that meet safety standards for swimming and fishing. We've developed incredible science and technology, spurred countless innovations, and more than 2/3 of America's assessed waterways meet water quality standards. It's appropriate that here, amongst such great partners in clean water, I emphasize that one of the greatest accomplishments of the Clean Water Act is the foundation for strong and meaningful partnerships at all levels. Federal, state, local government, the private sector, nonprofit groups, and just plain citizens working together. The Clean Water Act really set all that up. And the progress I described was only able to be made through the efforts of all these partners, all of you in this room and others, to move forward on clean water. But despite the progress in the past 40 years, there's still much more work to be done, and there are many remaining challenges. As Ken said just a moment ago, these challenges include population growth, our aging water infrastructure, nutrient pollution, the impacts of climate change, and emerging contaminants. The best path forward to clean water is still through this important partnership. It's because of the partnership that we made so much progress, and it's because of this partnership that we will ensure that we build on this progress for the next 40 years. So again, EPA thanks all of you for your incredible work to provide Americans with clean water, and happy 40th anniversary to the Clean Water Act. Thanks so much.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Karen Palanch. I am the CEO of Alexandria Renew Enterprises, formerly, as was noted, the Alexandria Sanitation Authority. And first off, cheers. Cheers to the Clean Water Act, correct. And you notice how easily we do that. We don't even take it for granted that in this glass is clean, safe water for us to drink and to enjoy. And this water is right out of our Potomac River. We do it without thinking about it, and we as professionals in the business, we understand the value of water to our lives and our livelihoods. But I'd like to tell you a story, a personal story, because we forget so easily, and we don't want to forget this. My husband was actually born and raised right here in Arlington, and he and his older siblings participated in crew in their high school. So he was racing and practicing right there on the Potomac River, right in the mid-'70s. And my husband loves to talk, and he loves to share stories about his youth, so I thought I would share them with you. He talks about the time when he's in the boats, and the coaches would be like, "Do not touch the water. Do not throw anyone in the water." He talks about the times when there would be storms, and it would push all the schmuck up into, technical term, schmuck up into D.C., and they would go out in the river, and there would just be all these dead fish floating along the river. Of course, they took the fish and started whacking each other with them. But I digress. But that's what he lived with. He talks about how it smelled. It was regardless of whether it was the winter or the summer. He would tell me how outhouses in the summer smelled better than the Potomac River. He talked about its color, that it's kind of like a mocha. It's this murky chocolate brown, and it even had that little froth on top. And on laundry days, it had a white froth that would go rolling down the river. So these are his memories. He remembers how they would get chastised if they pulled the skull out of the water and they didn't take like this paint thinner material and pour it over the hull to make sure they got all of that off of it. That was our drinking water supply 40 years ago. And that's what we have today because of the Clean Water Act. Teddy Roosevelt, who right now is probably a real legend here in D.C. for a whole lot of reasons, knew the value of clean and safe water. Long before sustainability, that word, became a lexicon or a cliche for us, he said, "The nation behaves well if it treats the natural resources as assets, which it must turn over to the next generation, increased and not impaired in value." And decades later, the ethos of conservation found its way into our Clean Water Act. Today we celebrate its 40th anniversary. It gives us the opportunity to look back and see how far we've come from those dead fish and those flats of algae, the milestones we've achieved, and the miles we still have to go to fully realize that vision of clean and safe water for every person, every second of every day in our country. And today, our needs, they're much more nuanced and much more complex than they were 40 years ago. Rather than viewing clean water through the single lens of a national perspective, which worked 40 years ago, we now have to have a local prism to view it through. We have to break out its constituent parts. And through this perspective, we're actually seeing new and unprecedented potential It's brimming with the potential of recovery and renewal of the precious resources that we have, as opposed to viewing this as sanitation or as waste. And it's not to say, though, that we don't have common challenges that face all of us. One of the biggest ones that we've heard before is that we have these very expensive capital improvements that we have to complete to make sure that we still have this each and every day. We find new things, we have to take it out. Not only that, but we have an obligation to the last 40 years where we've pumped billions and billions of dollars into our assets. And we have to make sure that they stay healthy. You know, in our business, you can't walk away. Like roads, like electricity, like mass transit, even like your home. You have to make sure that there's constant care and investment daily to keep up what you already have. The success for the next 40 years of the Clean Water Progress, it needs to come from shifting the prism of the current Clean Water Act. Success is going to depend on joint local efforts, those partnerships that you heard Alan talk about, as well as integrating community needs with community wants and desires, and allowing the community to choose and support those things that they want to put in to protect their waterways and their personal environments. Localities need a Clean Water Act that is flexible and innovative, that will allow local watershed-based solutions that support a business-like utility vision. So let me end with with the words of another visionary, Paul Allen, who is the co-founder of Microsoft. In my work, I've tried to anticipate what's coming over the horizon, to hasten its arrival, and to apply it to people's lives in a meaningful way. And because water and all of our natural resources are really worth it, that's our commitment at Alexandria Renew Enterprises. Thank you and congratulations.
Good afternoon. I'm Jerry Johnson. I'm General Manager and CEO at the Washington Suburban Sanitary Commission, where we serve about 1.8 million customers in suburban Maryland, providing them both water and wastewater services. In the 40 years that the Act has become the cornerstone of our efforts to improve the effectiveness of our wastewater treatment plants and to reduce the amount of pollution that goes into our waterways. People don't realize what a difference Clean Water Act has made in our lives. The fact that we can boat, swim, fish in waterways that previously were considered threats to public health as a direct result of this critical legislation. It is unheralded as an unheralded staple in our communities, and in the future, we will need funding for our infrastructure to ensure that it's maintained. We will need to start looking at sources of pollution, other sources of pollution in the waterway other than wastewater treatment and the things that we find in our industry. We need to look at what I believe to be, and I used to tell this story anytime I had more than 2 people in the room, that we need to stop looking at the siloed approach that currently exists in the Clean Water Act, an approach that will have us to complete and follow certain regulatory requirements, and certainly they have meant a great deal. They've meant secondary treatment, they've meant CSO control, they've meant a variety of different things in the system. And in fact, today, as we treat effluent at our wastewater treatment plants, we have something almost as clear, and is certainly as clear, almost as clean as the water that Karen was just showing us a minute ago. In fact, I flew over George's plant a couple of days ago, and you could see this major plume of clean water coming into the Potomac River from the wastewater treatment plant. So it was a cleaner water going in than the water that we were extracting. And those, but you know, that doesn't mean that we've not done a great job. I think that the Clean Water Act has done a fantastic job. I was at home recently. My mother's 85 years old, and I'll take a little personal privilege as well, Karen. And she asked me to go get her a 9-volt battery. I said, "What do you need a 9-volt battery for?" She said, "I got a transistor radio over here. I think it still works. I want to try it out and make sure that it's okay." And so I went about doing the chore. You don't dare not do things your mother tells you to do. I went and got the 9-volt battery. I brought it back, and she said, now, I can't open this thing. You got to get a little coin or a screwdriver or something and twist it in there, and it'll pop open. Then you put the battery in. I put the battery in, and sure enough, that transistor radio started to squeak, and it started to static, and I switched it from, it was very advanced, it had AM and FM. I switched it over to FM station, and sure enough, a station came on the radio. I pulled the little antenna up, it came a little clearer, and there we were with the transistor radio. But you know that that's not the technology that we're using today. I saw somebody, Lisa, back there with an iPad, out on the internet with something that's less than 1/4 of an inch thick, and with a 7-inch screen that you can watch TV on. So I say that, and I use that example to say now's the time. The time has come for us to update, to modernize the current Clean Water Act to ensure that it continues to serve us into the future. If we don't do that, it'll be like the transistor radio. We'll keep it in a drawer, and we'll pull it out every now and then to remind us that we have it there, and we'll continue to do things in silos, not recognizing the fact that all water is simply wet stuff. It is water. It needs to be somehow corralled and treated the same. So I believe that we need to start dealing with the worst problems of our waterways first, so that we're getting the greatest impact for the number of dollars that we're spending on a variety of different things. Does that mean that we stop doing CSO? Absolutely not, George. We've got to continue to do that CSO program. We've got to move steadily with that. But as we go into the future, let's think about the number of dollars that we've spent and the steep curve that we have to climb to get that last bit of pollution out under the current Clean Water Act. There are other ways of approaching that, and I think with the collective thought process of many of us in this room, for those of us who have been in this business for a while, we know how to go about doing that and making this Clean Water Act something that's useful well into the future for additional generations that we're going to have to deal with. I have several reservoirs that I'm responsible for, and the big push now in the jurisdictions that I serve is to ensure that we don't wind up with those reservoirs being like the Chesapeake Bay, that we go out and act now, right now, to take the steps to ensure that we've got the appropriate TMDLs in place and other measures in place, that we're protecting our source water. Remember that glass of water she had here, we don't know how many dinosaurs' kidneys that might have passed through before it got into the Potomac River, and because there is no new water. We're dealing with the same water over and over again. And I think as we're modernizing and updating the Clean Water Act, we have to consider that and remember that there are some different approaches. I believe that we, the utility operators who you're seeing here today, are some of the staunchest environmentalists that there are, and that we have done our job to and are continuing to do our job as the Clean Water Act evolves. We have literally spent tens of billions of dollars for things like CSO control, plant upgrades, and to ensure that we have quality drinking water available to us. And now there are other things that are approaching us, like new contaminants and various pollutants that we have now learned how to measure. We've learned to measure them so that we can see that they actually exist, but we've not turned our energy into making a determination about how we eliminate them and whether they are in fact harmful to us as human beings. So I think that one of the things that has to happen is that we've got to begin to stress the notion of research and development into new technologies and new approaches that might be taken that take us to that next step and go beyond. We need to stop letting the Europeans and the Australians and others beat us to this technology. We're going out and importing that technology, bringing it here to comply with the Clean Water Act as it exists here, when we ought to be spending more of those dollars in our own country and more of those dollars in the research environment. As I said, there is no more water, and updating, enhancing the Clean Water Act is the future, and it's going to be beneficial not only for all of us, but for all the generations and others that will well deserve to have an environment that's clean and pollution-free as we go forward. Thank you very much.
I want to tell you a story of a 9-year-old boy that I know. He took a trip from Cleveland Heights, which is up on the heights above Cleveland, on a bus. And he went down into the city of Cleveland, one of the great industrial cities of the world at the time, and down a second hill to the Flats. For those of you who've ever been to Cleveland, you know that the Flats is the area that snakes along the Cuyahoga River, which is one of the largest industrial concentrations in the world in the 60s. The year was 1969, and the boy was me. Talking about being personal about the Clean Water Act. When we got off the bus, it had been a bright sunny day when we left Fairfax Elementary School. By the time we got down to the Flats, it seemed to have clouded over. And we got off, the air was so thick and heavy, you couldn't get away from it. It had this incredible odor to it. And if you walked over to the river, which we did, you didn't see dead fish, you saw nothing other than it looked like a finger painting. Someone had, the old days, you'd take your fingers and mash around the colors on the water. That's how polluted it was. I remember asking the bus driver, what is that smell in the air? There are pictures of Lorraine Road in Cleveland at that era. You could not see from one end of the road to the other end, not because of smoke from a fire, but because of the air pollutants that were in the air every single day, day after day. And the bus driver said to me, that's the sweet smell of success. Well, the reason I'm standing before you today, one of the reasons why the Clean Water Act amendments to the Federal Water Pollution Control Act of 1948 was passed was because, as most of you know, there was a train car passing over the Cuyahoga River, and a spark from the wheel of the train went down into the river and ignited it on fire. But the Cuyahoga River didn't burn just once. There are 13 recorded incidents of the Cuyahoga River burning. Think about this as a treatment scheme. The way you clean the river is chuck a match in it and burn off the pollutants off the top. That is what we saw. I became an environmentalist that day. I didn't even know what it was. We all went back. I was in 4th grade. I still have the letter I wrote to President Nixon because the teacher kept them. We thought they sent them on that big yellow, it's so wide because you draw right like this, back when you actually learned to write instead of type this way. But I wrote a letter to President Nixon saying, we've got to do something. You could be 4th grade and you knew that was wrong. That was not a big think, that there was something amiss. Well, as we all know what happened, October 18, 1972, the Clean Water Act amendments were passed. It's a fascinating story, which I won't go into in great length, but it was vetoed by President Nixon. And you know why? President Nixon said it was too expensive. The plan at the time was to increase, which stayed in the act, expenditures to treatment facilities like ours from 55% to 75%. Upgrading that percentage of expense, President Nixon, which estimated $24 billion, said was too much, not cost effective, and he vetoed it. The bill was passed resoundingly in the House and the Senate over his veto, with the notion that the federal government should step up and pay for expenses where there's a national federal standard driving the costs. And in the decades that followed, in my judgment, echoing what you've just heard and will continue to hear, the Clean Water Act, in my judgment, is the most successful progressive statute of our time. How many issues can you say that in the activism of the 60s or the 70s that we identified a problem, put a resolution in place on a bipartisan basis, spent the money, and largely, not completely, solve the problem we were identifying at the time? When does that actually happen? We still have homelessness. We still have all sorts of problems we foresaw in the 60s or saw in the 60s. This one we have attacked and resolved. That should be celebrated. It is an extraordinary outcome of governance from both parties over decades. Today, just to give an example, the Cuyahoga River, they did fish counts in the 60s, like they do now. And in the stretch of the Cuyahoga down by Lake Erie, they counted 10 fish. Not 10 species, 10 fish. And most of them were this certain kind of fish that could live in anything. You know, they had all these growths on them, but they were the survival. I can't remember the name of it, but there was a hardy fish that could live, you know, outside of a nuclear plant if it exploded. That was it. Today, they do fish counts on that same stretch of the Cuyahoga River, and they find 40 species of fish. The Potomac River, which Lyndon Johnson said was a national disgrace, you heard personal stories about what it was like back then. An open cesspool, just incredible refuse. The National Bass Fishing Tournament picks 10 places to do their National Bass Fishing Tournament fishing test. And one of them is south, right out in front of Blue Plains, because it's the best bass fishing tournament fishing in all of the Potomac. But just imagine that. One of the largest advanced wastewater treatment plants in the world is so good at what it does, and I give Jerry all the credit. I've just come on board. I love being in a panel where Jerry was there because he really did. I stand on his shoulders in anything we were able to do today and the incredible progress made under his tenure at DC Water. But the fact that you have 300 million gallons coming from a treatment plant, and that is where the best bass fishing is on the whole river, is unbelievable. It really is unbelievable, but it's true. There is another story, though. Think of a fourth grader today going out to visit a water body. They're not going to see the obvious problems that I saw. You didn't need to know much to know that there was a problem on the Cuyahoga in 1969. Today, it's much more difficult to see what these problems are. Is it red tide? Is it oxygen-depleting algae that's overgrowing? Is it these new contaminants that we're not quite sure what they mean? It's a much more difficult problem. So I'm not sure the fourth grader of today is going to know exactly what the outcome is. The challenge we have is, in my judgment, the Clean Water Act has been astoundingly successful, but is doing what, in large measure, what it has always done. And it's just as Jerry mentioned, it's reaching the point where it may not make sense and risks fracturing the historic support that created it in the first place. Let me give Blue Plains as an example. When Jerry was general manager, they were able to reduce almost 8 million pounds of nutrients from 15 milligrams per liter to 5 for a $16 million capital investment. 8 million, 16 million gallons, $16 million. The next phase was to reduce the next 3 million pounds, going from 10 milligrams to 5 for $100 million. And now 5 milligrams for 100. The phase we are doing today is dropping that 1 more milligram per liter from 5 milligrams to 4 for $1 billion. It is 400 times more expensive to get the next tiny increment of nutrient out of Blue Plains than it was when we started. And we'll do it. Our enterprises will do it. The question we have to ask as a society is that a smart investment? You know, if we want to stop the problems we have in the Chesapeake Bay. In my judgment, the evolution that needs to happen is based on success, not failure. But the Clean Water Act needs to be retooled. I admire how much EPA is doing to be flexible and innovative, using the statute that was written with a problem from 40 years ago. To me, it is not a problem to say now 40 years later we need an update, a modification, an evolution of a statute when the circumstances had changed. The statute was designed with a different problem in mind. How do we make sure that every player that's a polluter or discharging into a river has equal responsibility? How do we do the worst problems first? How do we shift to new problems rather than to continuing to ratchet back at big facilities doing what we've always done and been successful at when the costs are shooting up on a cost-effective basis? To me, that means a change to the Water Act on a basis of success, not failure, to retool it so that a child today can look 40 years in advance. Now, the last thing I'll say before I turn it over to my friend Jeff is some people say, well, Mr. Hawkins, why would you ever do that? There's so much fracturing in Washington, D.C. and Congress if you tried to change the statute. Compared to 1972? I remember standing on Fairmount Boulevard watching the tanks roll down into the city of Cleveland that was burning in the distance. I remember, Kent State was in Ohio. I remember what we faced in the 60s and 70s with a country that seemed torn to shreds. It makes today look pretty mild if you think back on it. Yet there was a bipartisan deeply found and deeply understood support for something everybody can agree to, which is what needs to be done for a resource that not only supports every life, every organism, but every bloody job in the United States of America. So I think despite the challenges we know are true in Washington, they stepped up in 1972. We should celebrate the success of what they did. It is extraordinary, but we should be resolute in retooling the statute so we can get the next 40 years of protection as we go forth. Thanks so much.
What he said. I love George. We've got to know each other, and he is my hero. My name is Jeff Eager, and I have the honor of serving as the executive director of the Water Environment Federation, as was mentioned, an almost 85-year-old organization of clean water professionals who do this work day in and day out. And that's been on the job 20 months and 13 days. 17 years prior to that, I had the privilege of being a utility director in the second largest wastewater utility in Kentucky, Sanitation District Number 1. Folks are telling us stories from the past. When I was chairman of Orsenco, I did a little history, and I found out that the sanitation district in northern Kentucky back in the 50s had the first municipal wastewater treatment plant on the Ohio River. In the 70s, we upgraded to a secondary wastewater treatment plant that served the community for many years. And then what's interesting about that is that wastewater treatment plant was built with about 85% federal funding. While I was the utility director at Northern Kentucky, I built 2 more wastewater treatment plants, or water reclamation facilities, we call them, with 0 federal money, funded by the ratepayers of Northern Kentucky, paying rates that I don't think are exorbitant, but they certainly seem to think so. But as we all know the stories about what we pay for the other leisure things in our life, our cable and our cell phone, that's a bargain for what we pay for clean water. So I don't know about you, but whenever I've celebrated a major birthday, I seldom look back. I look ahead. I look ahead at what is next. Probably the staff at the Water Environment Federation will say, is there anything we can do to please this guy? WEF Tech, as you all know, is incredibly successful, and I thought this year it could be even better, and we need to do even more. And we just celebrated that coming in New Orleans, coming back from just a couple of weeks where we had almost 18,000 water professionals from around the world that came together to find out what the latest in technology, latest in innovation, to learn, to look at the equipment that can make our lives better. And so I think that our challenge today is that all these wonderful things that the Act has performed, but we have been the silent heroes. Jerry, George, Karen, and many other utility directors have just gone about doing their job day in and day out. In New Orleans, we had a Water Heroes Luncheon, and we recognized some of the operators from the New Orleans Sewage Board who had actually risked their lives to take care of that community during Hurricane Katrina. Now, most folks in that community probably had no idea that was going on, that those folks were there, and yet they felt a duty, they felt a commitment to do that. And what's a remarkable story is not only were they working diligently to try to pump the water from one basin to the next, but they even became first responders. They were even rescuing folks from their homes. And that's really the core and the fabric of the water professionals. But we've been silent heroes. We haven't really told the story. We just do our job. Well, it's time to change that. I think as we look forward to the next 40 years, I think that we need to embrace the innovation and technology that will continue to make us better. We've launched a program to try to help our water utilities become energy producers, not just energy neutral, energy producers, to really redesign and change the perception of how folks look at us, that we're really not a waste industry. We are a resource production industry. The technology is there, and we can do those types of things. But we also need to spread the word, and we need to get the attention. And along with NACWA and many of other partners, we've got a growing effort here with this Water for Jobs campaign to promote the fact that this economy has survived because of our commitment to it, to the things that are core and precious to us, and it's time to no longer take that for granted. And so we hope that you will join us. I'm pleased to see so many of the buttons out there today. 6 years ago, I thought tweet was something that chickens did. But we'll be tweeting like crazy tomorrow night during the debates, and I hope that you will as well, about water for jobs and the fact that water can get America moving again, and it can help to create the jobs, not only in the investment, but what job in America does not need clean water? When I was in Dallas earlier this year, there was a front page story about the serious drought that's occurring in Texas and the fact that they're going to lose $50 billion of economic impact of new jobs because they simply don't have the water to support the industries and the jobs that are out there to do that. So it's time, I think, as we celebrate the 40th year, to say what's next. And it's time to take the lid off of the silent heroes and to celebrate what can be and what will be, and to spread the word, and to make sure that we celebrate in 40 years from now how we've transformed our industry, and folks get it and appreciate it and are willing to support it. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Carlton Haywood. I'm the Executive Director of the Interstate Commission on the Potomac River Basin. One of the advantages, I guess, of coming at the tail end of this distinguished group is I can say, what all of them said. They nailed it. I have just maybe just a couple of comments that I can add to that. First, a little bit about ICPRB. It was created in 1940 for the purpose of regulating, controlling, and preventing the pollution of the Potomac River Basin by sewage, industrial, and other wastes. It was and is an investigative and advisory organization, and it serves an important role in stimulating collaborative action by federal and state agencies to reduce pollution in this watershed. What's really important is this multi-state watershed. And this collaborative approach, which is fundamental to what we do, I think is also a key aspect of what's made the Clean Water Act successful, in that we can't do our job without working with the states. And the Clean Water Act, although it set the regulatory framework, set down the rules, it then delegated to the states the responsibility for carrying it out. And even today, we applaud the EPA in working with the states and discussing in a collaborative way the setting of new policies before they come to fruition. As I said, ICPRB is a investigative and advisory body. It lacks the authority and resources to make things happen on its own. And although we think that we accomplished a lot in the 1940s, the 50s, and the 60s, it really wasn't until the Clean Water Act in 1972, in which the Clean Water Act brought that regulatory framework and brought the funding, that things really started to happen. And in the Potomac, perhaps the most visible expression of that is Georgia's story, that in 1965, the Potomac River was described as a national disgrace, and today is the site of national bass fishing tournaments. And I can add my own personal story to that. In the mid-1970s, when your husband was doing crew down in the tidal waters, I was a few miles upstream in Mather Gorge doing whitewater kayaking, and with my rather modest whitewater skills, staying out of the water was not an option. But it was sort of it was routine that on the weekends we would go paddling in Mather Gorge, and on Monday I'd have a sinus infection. That was just part of it. You go in the river, and you'd have an infection on Monday. But the Clean Water Act has done so much more for the Potomac Basin, from supporting the establishment of more robust state environmental protection agencies, to the revolving loan funds that provided the funding for the wastewater treatment plant upgrades, and working with the states to establish and then carry out the restoration of the Chesapeake Bay. But challenges remain, and for the most part, what we've done in the past 40 years is we've addressed that really gross organic and toxic pollution that you've heard about. But today, we have new pollutants. And to my mind, I sort of look at it as peeling back the layers of an onion. We took off that really gross pollution that made the river stink in the 1960s and early 1970s. And then we found, oh, well, there's nutrients. Well, we got to deal with the nutrients. And we're going a long way toward dealing with those nutrients, both in point sources and non-point sources. And as we're dealing with that, all of a sudden we're finding, well, there are these other things, these personal care products, these emerging contaminants, pharmaceuticals, things that we couldn't even measure in 1972 that are becoming new problems that we have to deal with. So much remains to be done. And that's the challenge ahead of us. We can congratulate ourselves for the accomplishments of the past 40 years, but we have to remain committed to carrying that forward. And I'll just leave you with one more comment, and that is that the population today is 50% greater than it was in 1972. And that means several things to us. One, there's a certain aspect of you've got to run faster just to stay in place, okay, with more people. All of those people, those additional people, mean more urban development, more pollution. Where does pollution come from? It comes from people. And in addition to these impacts on water, it also means there's a lot more demand for the resource. There's demand for drinking water, there's demand for recreation, all those other assets that water provides. There's greater and greater demand. So it makes our job of managing that resource more challenging. So there's a lot to look forward to. We can congratulate ourselves and say, you know, our job's not done. We're not going to be out of work anytime soon, I don't think. So we can, you know, we've got a lot to look forward to. All right, I thank you. Sorry.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Carlton. I'm Alexandra Dunn. I'm the Executive Director and General Counsel of the Association of Clean Water Administrators. And yes, we were the Association of State and Interstate Water Pollution Control Administrators for 50 years. I'm delighted to have Carlton, who serves on our Board of Directors representing the interstates, as well as Colin Burrell with the DC Department of the Environment, who serves on our Board of Directors from Region 3, here to provide expertise and moral support. I'm privileged to work with such dedicated individuals from all over the country who run state water programs. So I'm going to give you some perspectives from the co-regulators, from the states. So before the enactment of the Clean Water Act, if my organization is now in its 52nd year, that means we did predate the Clean Water Act. So before the Clean Water Act, states and interstates were working together to solve environmental challenges to water quality, and we are still here today. I had the privilege a few years ago of moving up to the Hudson River Valley. My parents are native New Yorkers. I was born in New York, and I hadn't lived there since I was about 9 years old, and I moved back when I was 38. And we lived not far. We lived in a little town called Croton-on-Hudson. And I called my parents our first weekend there because, of course, what's the first thing you want to do in a new place? If you're like most of us in the room, you go outside, right? We're not video game people here. We went out to the Hudson. We went out to the beautiful Croton Beach. And there was a swimming beach there, and there was a lifeguard. And we picked up all kinds of, shells and things. And I called my mom and I said, I think we're going to love living here. I just took the kids down, swimming to the Hudson. And my mother said, "You did what?" Because they remembered when you couldn't go in. And I think we've all have those personal stories. And, I was 5 when the Clean Water Act was passed. So, I'm very privileged to be working on a statute that is still unfolding. So what did the states do? How are we co-regulators, states and interstates? In 46 of the states, we run the major permitting program for the federal government in partnership with them. And in 2 states, as has gotten some recent attention, we run the wetlands permitting program. And actually more states are interested in taking on that responsibility going forward. But in all the states, we inspect and enforce facilities. We protect high quality waters, which is a whole new focus that Denise Keener and her office has really said, we spent so long dealing with polluted waters and impairments. I mean, do any of you remember in the first 30 years, 35 years, talking about high quality waters in any meaningful way? I mean, that was like maybe when we have some spare time. And now we can actually meaningfully talk about protecting high quality waters and keeping them. We involve the public in decision making. We are working on TMDLs. And now some of those TMDLs are starting to look at actually things coming off the 303D list. And we have a vision for the 303D program that looks at protection as well as restoration. Again, something that early in the statute's years, we couldn't have thought about it. And John Gooden's in the back. He's led that effort with Denise's support, and it's been incredible. And then we've looked at the expansion of the permitting program, and I don't think there's one of us in this room who wouldn't say that the MPDS permitting program is one of the most powerful tools in the statute and one of the most effective tools in the statute. And I certainly know John Devine sitting in the back knows how important that tool is, because we've seen a growth in things that are considered permitted sources over the years. But we still have challenges. As we've grown the program and worked so hard to bring more things like vessels and animal feeding operations and pesticide spraying, and maybe, depending on what the Supreme Court tells us, maybe forest roads, into the purview of the Clean Water Act regulation, because everyone sees how powerful it is. At the same time, we see the resources going down. And sadly, the last assessment we did of how much it costs to run the national program was 10 years ago. It was done in 2002. And in 2002, we had identified an $800 million gap needed for states to run the basic regulatory programs, and a $1.14 billion annual gap for non-point, based on 38 states. So that gap has probably grown. And then you look at what's ahead, because many of the prior speakers have talked about what's ahead. We're moving to e-reporting. Technology is changing how we do our work. I mean, there are inspectors out there in states doing CAFO inspections on iPads and radioing their inspection results directly back to the state so that action can be taken. And this would have been someone who, not that long ago, was driving in their car probably for 2 or 3 weeks in the field before they would get back with their paper reports that someone would then transmit and put into the database. And then maybe someone would say, we have to follow up, and it would be 2 months before you got back to that facility. So technology is changing how we do business. We look at future changes to the stormwater program, the CAFO program, changes to the water quality standards regs. Maybe we'll figure out soon enough what is a water of the United States. So, you know, we have a lot ahead. And so I would say that states and interstates are part of the solution. There's been, over the decades of the statute, ebb and flow in terms of trust of the capability of states and the ability of states to do their jobs. And I think for all of us, the next 40 years has got to be about building up that state capacity and interstate capacity, Carlton, and making sure that we're really out there in a true partnership, because there's a whole lot of water out there that needs to be protected. And there's only so many people that can do it. And so we're really excited about partnerships. Being here today with WEF and with NACWA is a representation of a true partnership, because without partnerships, we won't get there. You know, I sort of say we kept our heads down for 30 some odd years working on point source pollution, and we sort of looked up and said, still not there. What's missing? And now we're working on, again, these healthy water initiatives, these non-point initiatives, these working with ag. For years, states didn't work with the state departments of ag, and now we have regular getting-togethers with the state departments of ag. We're working with the state foresters. We just met each other. I just had a guy call me last week from the state mining authorities and said, I'm starting to do a lot of Clean Water Act work. I think we need to get to know each other. That's because the statute is evolving and the complexity of the water problems has evolved. So just in closing, I'd like to say that I think with partnerships, we will get there, because there isn't a group out there sitting in this room or outside in other rooms that doesn't want to see clean water, that doesn't want to move to a new community and the first thing, take their kids out to the river and do something cool and look for shells or, you know, pick up trash if that's unfortunately the problem. But bottom line is, we want our waters. They're valuable. They're absolutely valuable. So I'll close with a quote that has inspired me of late. You know, Steve Jobs, inventor of, you know, something that most of you are probably holding in your hand or in your briefcase. talked about the people working for Apple. And he said, everyone that comes in here every day feels like they're changing the world. And, you couldn't work anywhere better. And I thought, no, you can work somewhere better. You can work in water quality, because every day coming into work, the folks in this room and the many other folks that support us are changing the world. They really are changing the world. Yes, an iPod is a pretty cool way to change the world. So we've got to think about ourselves like if we were at Apple, and be that inspired about what our work is and how it might change the future. So happy birthday to the Clean Water Act. I know we'll all celebrate with cake afterwards and photographs, but before that, I was asked to perhaps facilitate some Q&A. So I'm just merely the facilitator. I'm up here and happy to offer questions. They can be to any of the prior speakers, and we'll just kind of field them from the podium. So thank you for my remarks and for the opportunity to speak, and let's open the floor for questions. Any questions? We're at the press club. I mean, people have to have isn't that what this is all about? Q&A? Gentleman in the back.
I cover energy, and I'm interested in some of the big energy water issues you see.
Oh, that's a great idea. Well, I'll speak first and then let these folks jump in. What I see, just 2 weeks ago, I was in Chesapeake Bay looking at animal feeding operations. And we were visiting poultry operations. And they are looking at ways to actually capture gases and wastes at animal feeding operations to manufacture energy. There also were solar panels on the roofs of the chicken houses. You didn't see that long ago. So that's one area where I see, of course, and then the hydrofracking and the water implications for issues like natural gas extraction certainly going to require. So there's some regulatory issues on the horizon, and then I think there are some practices in place on the horizon. George, Jerry, others? Yeah.
I'll make a quick comment. And the energy-water connection is very direct and easy to understand. I hope you always use public water, but if perchance you happen to buy a gallon of water or carrying a gallon of water, realize how heavy it is. In D.C., we are moving 100 million gallons of drinking water all around the city every day. And after it's used, because actually the amount that we collect and take down to Blue Plains is more like 300 million gallons of wastewater every day. We are the largest energy user in the district. Most people don't know that. Separate from all the other things, just to run our facilities, to move that much fluid. We have the largest turbines. We have direct connections into the grid because of how much power we use. On the other hand, as you've heard from so many, that the material, I'll say, for lack of a better word, that we remove from water that's been used, I heard someone call it enriched water rather than wastewater, is full of energy. So Jerry was the one who spearheaded this effort. I was able to bring it up, sort of close the deal, although we're now building it. As one example, and almost every utility is thinking about this or doing something, we're investing $470 million at Blue Plains, $470 million, building in the first installation in North America, and again, I give credit for Jerry for having spearheaded this, something called the Canby digesters. It will take that solid material, cook it at high temperature and high pressure. What that does is break down the cells of the solid material. It then goes into old-fashioned digesters, which can be smaller because the efficiency of the chemical reaction that drives methane is more efficient. We will generate 13 megawatts of permanent clean power at Blue Plains. That's enough power for 16,000 homes. We'll use it all at Blue Plains. Then the solid material that comes off after it's been cooked is so clean it's been sterilized. It still has nutrients in it, but it's not different from the fertilizer that you would buy at Home Depot. And because it's been heated at such high temperature, we can sell it as a fertilizer or give it to DDOT to plant trees in the city, which is what we plan to do. And we've reduced our carbon footprint by doing this process by a third. That's just one example of sort of the revolution. That's why Alexandria's called Renew. One of their issues is using energy and using our plants to generate resources. It's because we have such great energy use. The big tunnels we're building, think about this one. We're building a tunnel 23 feet in interior diameter, so almost 3 times the height of this ceiling, 100 feet below the Anacostia River. It's below the metro tunnels. And all that combined sewage, which is water and wastewater, stormwater and wastewater, which otherwise would flow to the river, will drop down these giant drop shafts, about 16-story fall, into this gigantic 13-mile tunnel and end up down at Blue Plains, all the way down at the bottom of a huge pit. And we've got to run these gigantic turbines to push it all to the surface and then cleanse it once it gets there. Just the energy use in our industry is breathtaking. But the potential to generate energy at every single facility. We're never going to run out of this food stock. We are never going to run out of this power source. Every single facility, thousands of them across the country, can be generating electricity, which is what the world is to come. So it's very exciting.
Anyone else want to address the energy question?
Well, I would. That is an example of what's going on out there, and there are many, and there are some even smaller than DC Water. The challenge again is money, though. It is the investment that needs to be made on the local level that sometimes is chasing other dollars that may not be as effective. So it is why we really need to support the investment in our infrastructure, because there will be a payback in 10 years. But right now, it's very difficult and it's very short-sighted for a lot of, I don't mean to be short-sighted. I think they want to do that on the local level, but sometimes it's really difficult. And that's why we need to tell these stories more, these possibilities, because then we will lower the cost for our children, the generations to come.
Just one more comment on that. And folks have alluded to the fact that our utilities are becoming less waste-oriented and more resource-oriented. We have an effort underway with the Water Environment Federation and the Water Environment Research Foundation, looking at ways to reach the point of the utility of the future. How do we get there? What are the barriers that currently exist in federal law that are in the way? And what are the incentives that we can provide to ensure that our folks around the country have what they need to go to the next level? We're looking forward to these results. This is something I think that we're going to be able to use in January when the new Congress convenes. It may relate to the Clean Water Act. It may not relate to the Clean Water Act. It doesn't really matter whether it does or not. But these are some of the new things that we're going to need to focus on. A lot of it involves energy, and a lot of it involves a lot of other things.
I think a great deal of effort is being put into things that we can do on site to save energy or to generate energy and that sort of thing, some of the things that George was describing. So reducing the volume of biosolids so that you have fewer trucks on the road, and that's thereby less pollution is one way to do it. Another way is to look at non-traditional resources for the generation of power. At WSSC, we've purchased about 20% of our power through wind power. So we actually bought into, as an entrepreneurial effort or entrepreneurial activity and a benefit to the ratepayers, a wind farm in Pennsylvania. And we are now part of a microgrid bringing power into our system that's renewable energy. So that's another way of doing that, just looking at some of the things that may be non-traditional and off-site from your facility.
That was obviously a great question to get us started. Any additional questions? Yes, gentlemen, also in the back, and then I'll come over here.
I used to get to hear Jerry Johnson talk a lot about what he thinks needs to be done with the act to try to capture some sources of pollution that we're not getting now. And I haven't had the pleasure of hearing him for a while. I'd like to have Jerry go up if you're in mind and just talk a little bit about how he sees any kind of revision of the Clean Water Act or what we could do under the Clean Water Act to get to some other solutions such as.
I have to first look around the room and see who's here. And Ken knows why. We were we're at Congress or Senate hearing, wasn't it? And I made a comment about the Clean Water Act having outlived its useful life, and the guy who I thought was reading a newspaper and not paying very much attention rose up and said, "I was at the table when the Clean Water Act was written. I dare you." And I had to send my lobbyist up to the Hill on several occasions to kind of clean up my name and have him understand that what I was really talking about was a need to modernize and update the Clean Water Act. I think the biggest problem that we have, and I mean, the Clean Water Act has done some tremendous things for public health, for safety, for our water bodies, and the development of technology and the creativity of some of our scientists and engineers to do things differently than we would have thought about doing them a number of years ago. But I think that what happens today is that we find that the Clean Water Act has a series of regulations, and I don't mean to disparage EPA, but sometimes the regulators don't talk to the permit writers, who don't talk to the people who are the enforcers, who don't talk to other folk, and all of those people need to be in the same room at the same time, so that we're not necessarily looking all the time at at a specific regulatory regime that only addresses a single problem or a single issue. I think the recognition of water being water, and the fact that at Blue Plains, as an example, it took us 4 years to convince the powers that be that we should be looking at stormwater and wastewater all coming into the same point, and the way that it was mixing and the way that we were going to have to deal with it saved us about $500 million off the project. But it took a long time to convince them of that. So this notion today of the integrated planning approach, I think, is the way to go. But it has to be more than just a notion and something that people are pushing from within EPA. I think that it's something that has to be codified. I think it's something that we have to address, and we have to expand beyond wastewater and stormwater. I think we have to look at all water as a part of this integrated planning approach. As I mentioned earlier, we have major reservoirs that we rely on and will continue to rely on for raw water supply for future generations. And if we don't start now to address some of the standards associated with that, along with the planning that we're doing for stormwater management and wastewater treatment, we will have missed the boat. So I think that this integrated approach is a great idea, but I think that that's the thing that needs to be codified, and that's the change around which the Clean Water Act needs to be framed, so that we're bringing all of these pieces together. And as I've said a number of times, we're dealing with the worst problem, or the most serious impairment of the waterway, and taking those one step at a time. As George indicates, it's a very, very steep curve when you get out on the end and start trying to get that last little bit of pollution. And maybe the biggest bang for the buck is something that you haven't started on yet, but it's not one of those regulations, so you just ignore it and let it go. So that's where I think we ought to be going.
I'm going to take, since I became the default moderator, just give you a perspective. At our annual conference of the states and interstates just a few months ago in August, we held a panel on sort of the statute and whether it needs to be changed. And when we did an informal show of hands of almost every state in the union in attendance, and the almost all of the 6 interstates in attendance, I'll tell you it was 50-50. And why is that? It's because it's a risky endeavor. It's a risky endeavor to start making changes to a statute that we all, I think in this room and today on its 40th birthday, agree that it's a very successful statute. And some of the most creative and innovative programs that we're starting to see that Jerry just referenced, integrated planning, protecting healthy watersheds. We're even we've just formed a work group of state regulators who work on drinking water and oversee that statute to look at how we can intersect Safe Drinking Water Act and Clean Water Act. Again, 30 years ago, who had time for that? I mean, each statute had its own mandates and deadlines. There was no way to talk about cross-pollination. So I think that the conversation will continue, because just like when someone turns 40, it's time to decide if you're working out enough, if you need to change your diet, if you're drinking enough water, DC tap water, of course. It's an important time to reflect on whether changes are made. I think we all know the political process means that the the right changes may sometimes be hard to make, and there's a risk of some changes that might not be that productive. So I would say tepid, but a general recognition that we could tune the car up a little bit if we could get the right group of people thinking about it in a holistic way. So that's some perspective from states and interstates I feel fairly comfortable conveying, given the robust discussion we had back in the summer. Anyone else want to comment on that issue or further question? I think this will be our last question before we go to the cake. So, sir? I already awarded the last question. My apologies. All right.
It's kind of a follow-up to that question. George, you mentioned that, if you think it's divided now, remember 1972 and how bad that was. But how do you spur something like this when you don't have the spark of, a river catching on fire? That was pretty dramatic.
That is the question of the day. I truly believe that there's been more attention on water for a lot of reasons. NACWA and WEF and WERF and all these organizations are elevating, but you can't help but pay more attention to water in almost any community in the country because of the sheer number of things that are happening. We have historic droughts, or we have these incredible floods. We had 4 historic floods in the district in the last 3 months that we hadn't seen in the last 50 years. So water is rising on the consciousness. Plus we have red tides. We have these dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico. It's a different kind of problem. And so is it going to be easy? Absolutely not. My judgment to that question that Doug asked is I believe what we know about the Clean Water Act that worked is uniform national standards that are attainable, but that push the envelope. And they have to be allocated to every major source regardless of where they're from. It's always been point sources, of course, as it should be. We need uniform national standards for how we're going to reduce pollutants from farm fields. We need uniform national standards for how we're going to reduce pollutants from suburban runoff, because that's where the pollution is coming from. That's not picking on anybody. That's just straight from the analytical information of where the pollution is coming from. My opinion of how you pay for it, and this is how you get folks into the game, is I believe everybody should get a water services bill. At the moment, most of the work is done by big utilities because we're the ones who issue bills to people and they pay us. So we spent $1 billion on that solution for nutrients for the Chesapeake Bay. I would bet, I don't know this for sure, I bet if you took every dollar spent in all of the states on agricultural runoff, it wouldn't equal how much we're paying in one city for nitrogen removal from one plant. Why? Because we have a mechanism to raise the money, to enforce, and to do the work. But if everybody got a water services bill, because everybody uses water, and that money was pooled by major watersheds, and then allocated back by the worst problems, so that if you're all of a sudden getting a bill for water services out in an agricultural sector, you said, I don't used to pay this bill. That's right, but guess what? Now we have a funding source, and in the first years, it's almost all going to go in that direction. Just stop doing any more blue plains, except at the margins, because it doesn't make sense to spend another $250 billion to remove that next milligram per liter until it rises on the priority list and is significant enough that it ought to get attention again, in which case, by all means. But until that rises, the money that everybody pays into a pot gets focused on reducing pollutants from the sources we know are the biggest. We can't walk around this issue or avoid it. It's agricultural runoff and it's suburban runoff. That are, in almost every watershed, the biggest sources. But if we had a funding source that instead of spending $1 billion, that would mean ratepayer money coming from the district, but being shifted out. It would cost less. So you'd pay less money as a district ratepayer. The money would go out to the hinterlands. The hinterlands would be paying in as well. They got skin in the game. But then you'd have uniform standards, which is what's worked in the Clean Water Act for that sector until the next one rose as the highest priority. Or maybe a new pollutant rises as the next priority. You prioritize based on risk, everybody pays in, and you shift the money to where the best outcomes are. And that's how, in my judgment, we can win the day, whether you're conservative, Democrat, liberal, or otherwise, because it can serve many purposes. But thanks so much.
I'm going to be a little more direct. We're all doing our job. Media, do your job. There's some great stories out there. You're not helping us. You want clean water as much as we do. There was a tremendous story on the front page of the USA Today 2 weeks ago. How many people in here saw it? Okay? Rising rates. But it didn't talk about why rates are rising. It didn't talk about the great things that are going on. These folks out here are working hard, and they're working hard for you and your kids and your future. You've got to help us. There's some great stories. Green infrastructure, we didn't talk about that today. Remarkable transformation in our industry. And EPA is doing everything they can to promote that. This administration is doing things to promote that. There are great stories out there. We're doing our job. I hope that you'll do yours too.
I think there's one more question over here somewhere. Yes.
Actually, talking about green infrastructure, what do you see the role of green infrastructure in helping us implement the future of the Clean Water Act?
Anybody like to take that? George?
I would say this is also an answer to the question you heard about how to build public support. The big tunnel that we're building that I mentioned works. We know exactly how much it works. You do the math about how much it contains, but people don't see it. I think one of the things that Jeff has been talking about, all of us in this industry are talking about, is connecting ourselves to our customers and the people who rely on us. So that we stand and say, this is the most important thing in your life, people agree with us because they know. One of the advantages of green infrastructure, which is all the green ropes and the bioswales and porous pavement, all that will contain stormwater in the same way a big tunnel does. But it's at the surface. It's where we walk and live and breathe and walk our dog. It's where we live our lives. So it can add so much to the quality of our lives. It can reduce energy use. It can create jobs that are visible and meaningful to the people in the community where those are being built. So I think we have to prove that green infrastructure has the performance level that we seek and we know we can get from a tunnel. But if we can overcome that obstacle, and that's over time with maintenance, what we get is an implementation of a technique that people see and become attached to, and therefore turn back around and support us when we need it to help pay for it. So I think it's an absolutely critical part of the future.
Okay, I want to thank everybody for being with us today. I don't think anybody's talking about rolling back requirements of the Clean Water Act or not meeting the goals. I think what we're talking about is creating a new 2020 vision for clean water for the future. And that's going to involve a lot of things. It's going to involve more flexibility. It's going to involve more time, particularly in considering that we're not expecting a lot more money from the Congress. So we're talking about local ratepayers' dollars. We're talking about local dollars. Affordability is becoming more of an issue. And we have to take that into account, as anybody else would. So if you look at the Clean Water Act 40 years ago, major incredible goals, zero discharge of pollution, but tough requirements, tough deadlines, and lots of money. 40 years later, we have tough deadlines, lots of requirements, and no money, same goals. I think what we're talking about for the future is we need more flexibility, and we're going to need more time, and we need a little better understanding of what it is we're trying to get and how we get there. It's not changing the Clean Water Act for the worse. It's changing it for the better. So thank you very much. Enjoy us and have some cake.